On April 11, 2011, a wealthy French aristocrat named Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès walked into a Catholic church in Nantes, lit 5 candles at the altar, and prayed for several minutes. Security cameras captured him leaving at 10:47 a.m. It would be the last confirmed sighting of him anywhere on Earth. 10 days later, police would discover something horrific buried beneath his family home's terrace, the bodies of his wife and all 4 of their children. And Xavier? He had simply vanished. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès wasn't just any father disappearing into the morning misty. It was nobility, a count by birthright, descended from one of France's oldest aristocratic bloodlines. At 50 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of old money, even as that money had largely evaporated. His wife, Agnès, was 48, a devout Catholic who worked as an assistant at a local school to help support their family. She'd wake at 6:30 every morning to prepare breakfast for their 4 children, always setting the table with the good china because, as she told friends, every meal together is a blessing. Their eldest, Arthur, was 21, studying at a Catholic university and planning to follow his father into business. He played classical guitar and had recently started dating a girl named Charlotte, who he'd met at Mass. Then came Thomas, 18, the athlete of the family who spent his weekends playing tennis at the club where Xavier had maintained their membership despite their financial troubles. Benoît was 13, quiet and bookish, forever sketching in the margins of his schoolbooks, dragons mostly, and medieval knights. The baby of the family was Anne, just 11 years old, with her mother's gentle smile and a collection of porcelain dolls that she arranged and rearranged on her bedroom shelf each night before bed. And so this was the Dupont de Ligonnès family of Nantes aristocratic, Catholic, keeping up appearances even as Xavier's business ventures crumbled one after another. They lived in a grand old townhouse at 55 Boulevard, Robert Schumann, with its distinctive blue shutters and the stone terrace out back where Agnès grew herbs for cooking. But beneath this careful facade, something had been building. Xavier had been telling strange stories to acquaintances, claims about being recruited by the American DEA, hints about witness protection, suggestions that his family might need to disappear for their own safety. Most people dismissed it as another of his grandiose tales, the kind of story a man tells when he's trying to explain away business failures. On the evening of April 3, 2011, the family had dinner together as always. Agnès made blanquette de veau, a traditional French stew that was Arthur's favorite. Anne helped set the table with the good china. Thomas talked about his upcoming tennis match. Benoît showed his father his latest dragon sketch. It was, by all accounts, a perfectly normal Sunday evening in the Dupont de Ligonnès household. None of them knew it would be their last meal together. None of them knew that Xavier had already purchased the bags of lime he would use to cover their bodies. The first sign something was wrong came on April 4th, when none of the children showed up for school. The Catholic school where Agnès worked received a letter, supposedly from Xavier, stating that he'd been transferred to Australia for work and the family would be relocating immediately. Similar letters arrived at Arthur's university, at Thomas's high school, at the tennis club. Each was typed on Xavier's letterhead, each bearing what appeared to be his signature. But the neighbors noticed strange things. The blue shutters at number 55 remained closed day and night. The mail began piling up. The herbs on the terrace, Agnès' pride, began to wither in their pots, and so naturally, when Agnès' sister tried calling and got no response for days, she grew worried. The school where Agnès had worked for years found it odd that she would leave without saying goodbye to anyone. Her closest friend, Marie-France, couldn't understand why Agnès hadn't returned her calls about their planned shopping trip. On April 7th, Xavier was spotted on security cameras at various locations around Nantes. He was alone. At a DIY store, he purchased several bags of lime, the kind used to decompose organic matter. At a pharmacy, he bought sleeving pills. At 4 different ATMs, he withdrew the maximum daily amount. Each transaction was methodical, purposeful. But here's what makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. While Xavier was making these purchases, while he was visiting banks and pharmacies, his entire family had already been dead for 3 days. They were already buried beneath the terrace where Agnès had grown her rosemary and thyme, covered in the lime he would return to buy more of, as if one bag hadn't been enough. The real horror began on April 21st, when police finally entered the house on Boulevard Robert Schumann. Agnès' sister had been persistent, and eventually investigators agreed to check on the family. What they found inside was a house frozen in time dishes in the sink, homework on Thomas's desk, Anne's dolls still perfectly arranged on her shelf. But it was what they found beneath the terrace that would shock France to its core. The investigators noticed freshly disturbed earth near the back of the garden terrace. As they began to dig, they discovered the first body wrapped in a white sheet. It was Agnès. She had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber rifle, the same hunting weapon Xavier had inherited from his father. But as they continued excavating, the true scope of the horror emerged. Beneath Agnès lay the bodies of all 4 children, each wrapped in sheets, each shot in the head while they slept. The lime had been spread between the layers of bodies, and religious objects, crosses, and rosaries had been placed with each victim. Therefore, this wasn't a crime of passion or sudden rage. This was methodical, planned, almost ritualistic in its execution. The toxicology reports would later reveal traces of sleeping medication in the victim's systems. Xavier had drugged his family's final meal before carrying out his plan. But that wasn't even the worst part. As investigators pieced together the timeline, they discovered that Xavier had maintained an elaborate deception for days after the murders. Those letters to the schools? He'd sent them after killing his family. The story about witness protection that he'd been spinning to friends? It intensified after April 3rd, with Xavier calling associates to say he was leaving for the United States under a new identity as part of a DEA operation. What they discovered next changed everything. In Xavier's abandoned car in the parking lot of a Formula One hotel in Roquebrune, police found a letter addressed to his brother, a rambling manifesto mixing truth with bizarre fiction. In it, Xavier claimed he'd been working as an informant for the DEA, that he'd infiltrated drug trafficking networks, that they were coming for his family. He wrote that they would need to disappear, that he'd found a way to protect them through his contacts in America. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn. Among Xavier's possessions, investigators found evidence that he'd been planning this for months, possibly years. There were survival guides, books on assuming new identities, and detailed research on countries without extradition treaties with France. They found receipts showing he'd been slowly selling off family possessions, converting everything to cash. He'd even researched the decomposition rates of human bodies and the effectiveness of lime in accelerating the process. But perhaps most chilling were the photos they found on his computer. Hundreds of images of his sleeping family members, taken over many nights, as if he'd been rehearsing, planning, waiting for the perfect moment. In one folder labeled Der Tag, German for the day, he'd saved articles about family annihilators who had successfully disappeared. The investigation revealed that Xavier had left Nantes on April 15th, taking a carefully planned route south. Security cameras tracked him to Roquebrune-sur-Hagens, where he abandoned his car. After that, nothing. Despite one of the largest manhunts in French history, despite his face appearing on wanted posters across Europe, Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès had vanished as completely as if he'd stepped off the edge of the world. The most disturbing evidence came from Anne's diary, discovered hidden beneath her mattress. The 11-year-old had written just days before her death, "Papa seems sad lately. He hugs us longer at bedtime." Her final entry, dated April 2nd, mentioned that her father had been teaching her to pray the rosary, something he'd never shown interest in before. The police reconstruction of that final night is almost too horrible to contemplate. After dinner on April 3rd, that last meal of blanquette of all the family had settled into their evening routines. The sleeping medication Xavier had mixed into their food would have made them drowsy. One by one they'd have gone to bed, perhaps with Xavier tucking them in, saying good night as he always did. The forensic evidence suggests Xavier started with the children. He entered each bedroom with his father's hunting rifle. Thomas first, the athlete who'd never wake for his tennis match. Then Benoît, the quiet artist whose dragons would remain forever unfinished. Arthur, the eldest, shot twice. Perhaps he'd stirred at the sound. And finally, little Anne, clutching the rosary her father had given her. Agnès was last. The evidence indicates she was awake when Xavier entered their bedroom. There were defensive wounds on her hands. She had seen what was coming. In those final seconds, she must have known what he'd done to their children. The terror and betrayal she felt in that moment facing the man she'd loved for 20 years, the father of her children, now standing before her with a rifle, is unimaginable. Xavier shot her twice, then spent the next hours wrapping each body in white sheets, dragging them one by one to the terrace he'd already prepared. Between each layer of his family, he spread lime and placed religious objects as if this ritual could somehow sanctify what he'd done. By dawn on April 4th, the Dupont de Ligonnès family lay buried beneath the very terrace where they'd shared summer dinners, where Agnès had taught Anne to plant herbs, where the boys had played as children. In the days that followed his disappearance, reported sightings of Xavier poured in from across the globe. A monastery in Italy, a casino in Las Vegas, a beach in Brazil. French police investigated every lead, but each proved false. In 2019, they thought they'd finally found him at Glasgow airport, but DNA testing proved it was merely a look-alike. The house at 55 Boulevard Robert Schumann stands empty now, its blue shutters permanently closed. Neighbors cross themselves when they pass. The terrace where Agnès grew her herbs, where her body and those of her children were found, has been filled with concrete. In Leith, Charlotte still keeps the last text message Arthur sent her, "See you Sunday after Mass." Thomas's tennis racket hangs in the club's memorial case. The dragons Benoît drew have been collected by his art teacher, who couldn't bear to throw them away. And somewhere, perhaps in a church nobody knows about, there may be 5 candles that continue to burn, lit each April 11th by a man whose crimes ensure he can never stop running. The French police maintain that Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès is alive, hidden somewhere under an assumed identity. The case remains open. The aristocrat who murdered his entire family and vanished hasn't been seen in over 13 years. He's still out there, somewhere,